All right. With the announcements out of the way, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. I have to admit, I'm kind of excited and surprised to see so many people out here for banking. We've done high noons on corn palaces, on fires, on all this exciting stuff, grocery stores, but banking. This is probably the hardest sell I've ever had to do for a history at high noon. For those of you who don't know, my name is Haley Aguirre. I work over in our archives department. Okay. I work over in our archives department with Tom Munson. I'm Archival Records Clerk, and I've been with the museum for about 2.5 years now, and absolutely love my job, and I love doing stuff like this. So we'll get into George Weare here. This is a picture of him from about 1866 when he was our mayor. You can go ahead and hit the lights, Connie. From when he was our mayor. George Weare was born in 1834, and he died in 1908. And like I said, banking is kind of a hard sell, but George Weare and his family were quite influential in Sioux City's early history and into the Victorian era and beyond. And so I promise this is going to be much more exciting than it may sound in the initial outset. George Weare was born in Derby Line, Vermont on December 3rd, 1838. Derby Line is an unincorporated village on the Canada border. Today it is a little bit more than a crossing station. And you can see it right up there with that red star. He was the son of John and Cynthia Ashley Weare. John Weare was a lumberjack and a carpenter, and he was a veteran of the War of 1812. He lost one of his legs in the Battle of Plattsmouth, and because he was a carpenter, just fashioned a brand new wooden leg for himself. It's a story about John Weare, George's father. The Weare family is of English stock, and their ancestors were prominent enough that they were awarded a coat of arms by the royal family, which you can see right over there. George Weare was the youngest of 11 children born to John and Cynthia, and here you can see the ones that are still around in 1872. George is standing in the back there. The numbers next to each one of their names indicate the order of their birth. John Weare Jr., their number 3, was the oldest son, and he ended up taking over a lot of the family's affairs when his father, John, lost his other leg in a lumberjacking accident in Michigan. And you can guess what he did there: fashioned one more wooden leg for himself and some crutches so he could get around. But after that accident, John Weare Jr. ended up taking over most of the affairs of the family while they were in Vermont and later on in Michigan. You'll notice, by the way, numbers 5 and 6, Mary Ann and her sister Lydia have the same last name. Yes, they married brothers. It's just, it's kind of just what happens when you're out in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. In 1846. The family moved there 1846, and the town of Cedar Rapids was incorporated in January of 1849. Most of George Weare's siblings would remain in Cedar Rapids for the remainder of their lives. John Weare Jr. especially was highly influential in Cedar Rapids society, politics, and business. He built this gigantic house called Bluffview Place in 1870, and you can see him and his family standing on the front porch there. I haven't gotten a really good indication of where this house was other than on the west bank of the Cedar River, which, if you've ever been to Cedar Rapids, is not exactly helpful. But from what I can tell, it is not there anymore. I haven't found any records of it or anything, so I do not believe that Bluffview Place is with us any longer. But at one time, it was the home of George Weare's older brother. Well, in 1849, there is a huge emigration in the United States from the east moving west for the California Gold Rush. Lots of people are moving through Iowa and the Midwestern states, and they want some kind of banking house in which they can set up the future for this mountains and mountains of gold they're, of course, going to find out in the Rockies and in California. So John Weare Jr., who you can see up there, and this guy, the Honorable George Green, who was just another highly influential Iowan and Cedar Rapids promoter, formed the banking house of Green and Weare in about 1850. Now, I say that with a giant asterisk attached to it because the Constitution of the state of Iowa, which was adopted in 1846, did not allow banks. Banking had been illegal in Iowa since it was formed as a territory. So what in the world do I mean when I say a bank formed, and why was banking illegal in the first place? Well, the short answer is because counterfeiting, and the long answer is like fiendishly complicated. So we're going to go with what I like to call the middle version, and I have condensed the absolutely riveting tale of Iowa's early banking history into 3 major need-to-know points. You're welcome. Number 1, to the 1840s, 1850s mind, a bank is merely an institution that prints paper money, and that's it. It can do other things, but that's what it's for, is for printing paper money. Now, thanks to Andrew Jackson, we don't have a federal currency, so these banks are printing paper money pretty much on their own and pretty much unregulated. This is a problem. Here's what's happening. Say this Agricultural Bank of Tennessee, because that was the JPEG I could find, forms up, and I go deposit a certain amount of my gold, and they hand me this piece of paper. I deposit $5 worth of gold, and then they hand me this piece of paper. So these bills, these early bills, are pretty much working like checks in this day and age. So I put my gold into this Agricultural Bank of Tennessee. They hand me this piece of paper, and they are ensuring that that is worth that $5 of gold by crossing their hearts, hoping to die, and sticking a needle in their eye. That's all the insurance they need. So I take this piece of paper, and I go to a general store, and I buy some provisions, $5 worth, let's say, and I hand them this piece of paper. And then the general store owner takes this piece of paper to the Agricultural Bank of Tennessee to get his gold. There's a problem. The Agricultural Bank of Tennessee has disappeared. It has gone, quote, into the realms of the wildcats, never to be seen or heard from again. So this is what we call wildcat banking, and this was absolutely epidemic at this time period in the early United States. These banks were opening up, taking gold, issuing these useless bits of paper for that gold, and then disappearing before any of those pieces of paper could be cashed. This is a problem for a burgeoning economy. So a lot of states, when they found, including Iowa, just said, you know what, screw it. No banking, none of it. Nope, we're not dealing with it anymore. No banking of any kind, none. And so that is why banking was illegal, because of this wildcats practice. Point number 2, so when I say a bank forms, what I actually mean is a company has formed. And these companies are primarily interested in real estate exchanges. These are companies that are trying to get people to settle into Iowa and settle on the land in the state. Here you can see some ads from the Sioux City Eagle in 1857 of these kinds of companies. Now, they might call themselves bankers, but they are not, by law, banking, because they are not printing money. So they can call themselves banks, they can kind of do whatever they want, but they're not seen as banks, because again, banking is illegal. And so so what kind of business do these companies, these quote-unquote banks, do? I'll kind of explain that, hopefully, as best I can. So here's an example of an early banking transaction. Say I want to buy some land in Iowa. Well, the average tract of land that people are buying around here is 160 acres. Now, that's going to cost you $200 to buy that 160 acres. Again, this is an era of land speculation. Everybody thought that the railroads were going to come move into town, and they were going to pay big dollars for this land to build a railroad on. And so you want to own this land before the railroad comes so you can sell it to them. So therefore, this was thought as a fair price, even though that's a lot of money. Here's a problem. The government land office only accepts gold. Now, I have gold, but not $200 worth. So how do I get my land? How do I enter this stuff in here? You know, how is this going to work? I go to a bank. I approach a banker and say, hey, you know, I want this land. Can you help me out? And they're like, sure. Banks at a high startup cost. They were normally funded by people who were already wealthy. And so the banker's like, I have gold. $200 worth. I will put that gold into the land office and get you your deed for your 160 acres. However, I want a cut of this deal too. So here's the offer I'll make. You are going to have to give me $280. However, I will allow you to pay it over the course of a year. In the event that the end of the year approaches and you haven't given me my $280, your land is mine. So when you hear stories of people out in the Wild West, banks foreclosing on all these farmsteads and all these properties, this is why. This land did not develop near as fast as people thought it was going to. And so these banks are now holding all these land deeds that they then send to developers to build things like towns and railroads and all that kind of stuff. So a banker in the right place at the right time can make a killing using deals like this. This, by the way, like buyers thought they were getting a huge deal with this too. You know, they didn't see these bankers as crooks because, again, they thought their land was going to be worth twice that come a year. So they're like, heck yeah, this is an easy deal. I'll get my land and all I'm out is $280. Score. No. And point number 3, this whole bunch of craziness ends in 1858 with the passing of what we call the Free Banking Act, which establishes the state banks. Now there is one banking system for the entire state of Iowa that is in charge with printing money, and it's state-backed, and it's there's a repository in the state banks for all these dollar bills to be gold-backed, and it's a much safer, regulated system. This state system would be lifted in 1863 with the establishment of the National Bank and our federal currency system. Sorry, Andrew Jackson. So there's what a State Bank of Iowa bill would have looked like at one time. And fun fact, the first national bank to open in the entire country under this 1863 national banking law was in Davenport, Iowa, named just the First National Bank. And you can see a picture of it down there. This building is still there from what research I could find. However, it's been heavily altered. Okay, back to George Weare and the rest. So in 1851, George Weare joined his older brother's firm of Green and Weare Banking House in Cedar Rapids, and by 1855, they had over 5 locations in 5 different Iowa cities, usually partnering up with other people who are living in these towns. By 1857, the Sioux City Eagle, you can see they have quite a bit more than that, branching out to all kinds of different Iowa cities. Now this bank is expanding quickly, and it's as Iowa is getting settled, people are starting to settle farther west. So John Weare turns to his brother and says, hey, there's these new towns opening out west, go open up one of my banks out there. And George is like, okay. So he travels by Wagon Road from Cedar Rapids into Fort Des Moines, and then travels from Fort Des Moines up to Fort Dodge. Now this is a modern map with the wagon roads just drawn on it. And I've highlighted there in yellow the route that he would have taken, the route that actually existed in November of 1855 while he's moving there. So he goes out to Fort Dodge, establishes this new bank, and while he's in Fort Dodge, he's like, hey, there's this like new town opening out on the Missouri River that people are going to think is a really, really big deal called Sioux City. So John Weare Jr. sends out somebody else to run the bank in Fort Dodge, and George Weare sets out for Sioux City, traveling through Fort Des Moines and later on to Council Bluffs, and then up along the Missouri River Wagon Road here to Sioux City. And he left Fort Dodge in early December 1855. When he left Fort Dodge, he forgot that that book which should always be the young man's companion, his Bible. He had left it at home in Cedar Rapids, packing his trunk in Fort Dodge, and realized, oh no, I don't have my Bible with me. And I know he left it because he told me. He went down to Fort Des Moines and purchased this new Bible, which you can see on the left there, and wrote a nice little note in the front page of how and why he purchased this Bible. So I think it's funny that, yes, you're traveling across the plains of Iowa in the middle of winter, and it's snowing, and it's cold, and you're completely fine with all of this, but you're not fine with doing it without your Bible. Gives you an idea of the kind of character George Weare was. He was a devout Episcopalian throughout his entire life. And on December 26th, the day after Christmas, 1855, George Weare arrived here in Sioux City. And by his own words, the entire town was a cluster of cabins settled on the mouth of Perry Creek. Now, this painting depicts a little bit later event. This is the steamboat Omaha, which came here a year later in 1856. But you can see that little cluster of cabins there that's depicted in this painting. And I like to think that that's kind of what George Weare saw when he came out here to Sioux City and saw our little cluster of cabins around Perry Creek. So he traveled to Pearl Street and went to the only hotel in town called the Hotel Tremont, by nobody but the guy who built it. Everybody who actually stayed there called it the Old Terriffic for the, quote, gratuitous hospitality that they received there. I don't know what that means, but it's a frontier town in 1855. It's probably nothing good. The Hotel Tremont was later purchased by John Hagee and his wife, and they ran the Hagee Hotel out of that log cabin. And it would have been a log cabin originally, but the Hagees rebuilt it into the Hagee House, which was established near 2nd and Pearl. And here you can see it in this photo in about 1865, that nice little wood frame building from that log cabin. Well, George Weare found out really quickly that if you want to do business in town, you need to go to the center of business in town, 2nd and Pearl Street, the Sioux City Land Office, run by that guy up there in the corner, Dr. Stephen P. Yeomans. And so George Weare goes up to Yeomans and he goes, "Hey, I want to start a bank here. You guys look like you need a bank. There's land being sold all over this area. I want to start a bank here." And Yeomans like, "You mean a business, right? Because banking's illegal." And George Ware's like, "Yes, that's what I meant. Yes, totally." So Yeomans is like, "All right, well, I got my little log cabin land office here." This is word for word, by the way, how these interactions went down. I absolutely assure you, I've researched this heavily. Yeomans is like, "Okay, I got my little log cabin land office here." We have a nice artistic reproduction of what that land office might have looked like. And Yeomans runs the land office out of the front first story of the cabin. And he and his family live in the room behind. Yeomans is like, "I got this like half story up above the land office that I'm not really using. So if you want to open your not bank up there, you are totally welcome to. However, you need to build a staircase to get to it." And George Ware's like, "My dad fashioned a wooden leg for himself. I think I could figure out a staircase." And so he built his staircase up on top of the land office, and so the story goes, he procured a dry goods box for a counter and a tin box about the size of a woman's cake box for a safe. And that is how Sioux City's first bank began. This is a later more and Shankbird grocery crate, so it's not a dry goods crate, but you get the idea. And then that little box right over there, one of my favorite pieces in our entire collection. It is on display. If you go into the cabin and walk past, there's a table in which a chessboard and then this little black box is sitting behind it. We're lucky to have a lot of artifacts and archives donated by George Ware's family over the years, and this box is one of them. This is reportedly the very box that George Weare packed up in Cedar Rapids with his startup capital for this bank, traveled out here to Sioux City and used that same lockbox as the first safe. So it's quite an amazing piece of Sioux City history wrapped up in a rather unassuming tin package. All right, so in spring of 1856, Yeomans approaches George Weare, and he's like, "Hey, I just purchased a whole bunch of land up at 6th and Douglas because this flooding thing sucks." "Yeah. So do you want to come move with me? I have enough land for the both of us, and we can procure some more logs from over across in Nebraska." And George Ware's like, "Yes, that sounds awesome." And so the land office and George Ware's bank moved up to 6th and Douglas. The land office was established at the northwest corner. That is where the police and fire station is today. It used to house this building, the public library building, which was our first city hall. And over in the northeast corner, where our current city hall is, was George Ware's bank. So again, still log cabins at this point. They procured some more logs and built these two log buildings up at 6th and Douglas. In March 1857, Sioux City now has a sawmill that's getting underway, and so now we can have wood frame buildings rather than log cabin buildings. And so in March 1857, George Weare built a wood frame banking house for himself. Here you can see a drawing of it, and kind of a crappy picture I had to take out of a newspaper clipping, but that's what the first wood frame bank building in Sioux City looked like. And shortly after that, we have the Panic of 1857. Now, for those of you who don't know, a panic is essentially kind of a mini economic depression. In the Panic of 1857, a bunch of Eastern businesses and banks failed over in the East, and when people lose all that money, and when people lose all those businesses, they run out of money to invest in places farther west. And so a lot of businesses in Iowa and in Sioux City in general closed as a result of this economic panic, and George Weare now has to figure something out if he doesn't want the same to happen to his own banking house. So, sometime in 1857, George Weare returned to Cedar Rapids to dissolve his connection with his brother's company, Green and Weare, because operating under the assumption that if I'm going to fail on my own terms. And so he dissolved his connection with his brother's company, and while he was there in Cedar Rapids, he married Mary Carpenter on August 11th, 1857, and you can see her picture right there. I unfortunately don't have a young picture of her, but apparently she was quite the looker back in the early 1850s. We have a nice little stack of Valentines that were sent to her, one of which you can see right there. And they're just some of the most entertaining things to read because, trust me, nobody does witty poetry like them Victorians. And Mary Carpenter is quite the character, too. She was known in the family for having exactly 3 wigs, one on her head, one on her wig stand in her bedroom, and the other in Chicago getting cleaned and styled. And she just rotated them constantly. So George Weare and his new bride returned to Sioux City, and throughout the year of 1858, he operates the Sioux City Bank alone. By the way, this banking thing, the thing we've been doing for a while, yeah, it's actually legal now. And so George Weare's bank is still really focused on real estate and being a land agency. Again, banking or not. We're just allowed to use the word bank now and mean actually what we mean. But he's still heavily involved in real estate to help kind of branch out his business. He also is a notary public and conveyancer, which essentially is a fancy word of saying I help people give deeds to other people who want deeds. In 1859, he entered into a brief partnership, gosh, I can't talk today, into a brief partnership with this guy, John H. Charles. Charles became more famous for his involvement in the dry goods industry, first with Milton Tootle and the firm of Tootle and Charles, and later on he became involved with W.H. Livingston and his company. W.H. Livingston once ran his dry goods business out of the Peirce block, which if some of you remember where Hatch Furniture was, that's where that was, at 415 Peirce. There's a picture of that Peirce block in that business in 1886. So Weare entered into a brief partnership with Charles, but this is not the partnership that would last the test of time. And before I go any further, I have to tell you about this guy. John Perry Allison, no relation at all to the Robert Perry from where we get Perry Creek. He was a lawyer and a New Hampshireite, and he came out here in 1856 as a clerk for the Sioux City Company. The Sioux City Company was the company started by Bernard Henn, Jesse Williams, and John Cook, and they were essentially, again, just another real estate agency buying up land, selling it to speculators, and hopefully eventually to a railroad. After that, he started doing his own real estate thing with a man named Robert Means. Robert Means would become our first Sioux City mayor. And there's an ad for their business, Means Allison and Company. Shortly after that, John Allison built himself a gigantic house at 808 Douglas. This eventually became the Hawkeye Club, and you might see pictures of it. Later on as the Hawkeye Club, but it was built as the House of Allison. He was county judge, county treasurer. He was served on the school board for a while. He was one of the founders of the Sioux City Gas Light Company. Again, just another big, important Sioux City developer and socialite. I don't have time to talk about him over more than just this one slide, but he was another influential person. And I'm talking about him in the first place because on September 6th, 1860, George Weare and John Perry Allison formed a partnership together, the Weare and Allison Bank. They dissolved all their connections with the businesses beforehand and formed this new bank. This bank lasted from 1860 to 1901. In 1890, on its 30th anniversary, the Sioux City Tribune heralded the bank as the longest-lasting bank in Iowa's history, at least at the time. This is a very successful bank, a very long-running bank, and very influential all around for early Sioux City history. So throughout the 1860s, Weare and Allison kind of just keep doing the real estate thing. This is a land notice to taxpayers in O'Brien County. The tax laws are changing, and they want to make sure that they protect their investments out there. Over there is a little booklet that they published on why northwestern Iowa is awesome and everybody should live there. And then in May 1869, they built a new building for their banking house at the corner of 3rd and Pearl Street. And hey, look at that. It's a far cry from the top story of a land office. This one's made of brick. Sioux City's brick industry is well underway by this point, and they could have gotten the bricks from this guy, John Rochelle, who you can see his brickyard there at 11th and Summit. That began in early 1869. It is shown there in that picture in 1889. In 1870, the bank started an insurance branch headed by Edwin C. Peirce. Peirce would become a major developer of Morningside. Peirce Park is named after him. Peirce got a start running the insurance branch of the Weare and Allison Bank and then eventually bought and later sold it. And here are some of the insurance companies that they are working with: Franklin, Phoenix, and the Security Insurance Company. I got all these ads out of an 1872 edition of the Chicago Tribune, and I remember looking at it and I'm like, why in the world are all these fire insurance companies setting up base in Chicago in 1870? The Great Chicago Fire happened a year earlier in 1871, and suddenly everybody in Chicago was super concerned about getting their fire insurance squared. In 1872, Weare and Allison bankers were a founder of the Sioux City Gas Light Company. These are making natural gas streetlights, and they lit the city's first streetlights on St. Patrick's Day of 1873. This company folded around 1889 when it was purchased by a Philadelphia holding company. However, their works at 1st and Court Street, which you can see there, were purchased by the Sioux City Gas and Electric Company, and they replaced those gas streetlights with electric streetlights. And in 1878, the Weare and Allison Bank built their final new building at 405 Pearl Street. And this is probably the picture that most people associate when they hear Weare and Allison Banking is this location. This picture is quite a few places. There actually is a history project on display right now for our 4th grade history project exhibition that shows this bank. And according to what I've heard, the vault for Weare and Allison's bank is still underneath 405 Pearl Street. It's still in the basement of Briar and Bow. So that's kind of neat, and that's what that history project is about. So definitely go check that out if you haven't already. Over here is a check that was written, published by Weare and Allison bankers. It was written to T.S. Martin. So that's kind of neat. This is a parade along Pearl Street sometime in 1894, and with the arrow there, you can see the Weare and Allison Banking House right there on Pearl Street. Like I said, we are lucky to have a lot of artifacts and a lot of archives from George Weare's family. One of their donations was this, the roll-top executive desk used by George Weare in his Pearl Street bank. According to legend, his desk was kind of in a back office of the banking house. He could see people come in his bank from Pearl Street, and by the time they made it from the front door back to his desk, he had already decided if he was going to grant that man a loan or not. This used to sit in the front room of the Peirce mansion in what is now the library, and that's what this picture is from. Another thing they donated was this key that I was told was from the 1856 original bank, which I kind of questioned because that would have been again, the top floor of the Sioux City land office. So I'm not sure about that, but I'm assumed that this was a key to at least one of the Weare and Allison banks. And of course, everybody wonders what happened to the Weare and Allison Bank now. Well, in 1893, we had another financial panic, one that was far more devastating for Sioux City, the Panic of 1893. And so in response to that, a few years later, Weare and Allison merged with the Iowa State National Bank. And George Weare served as president of that Iowa State National Bank from 1901 until his death in 1908. After Weare's death, the Iowa State National Bank merged with First National Bank, which had been started by T.J. Stone, and they were in this building at 5th and Peirce Street. Some of you may recognize it. First National Bank later combined with First Star, and is today all of the assets of First National is owned by U.S. Bank, still at 5th and Peirce in the new First National building that they built. All right, so that's all business. On to George Weare's personal life. As I mentioned earlier, he was mayor in 1866, and he was also a charter member of the Sioux City Boat Club. Here you can see canoers on the Big Sioux, right in front of the Boat Club boathouse on the right there. He was a Mason, member of the Terriffic Lodge. That first document there is an invitation to a multi-brotherhood Masonic banquet that was held in 1871. He was also a member of the Hawkeye Club. This card was sent to George Weare's family when he passed away in 1908, signifying him a member of the club. He was a financier of the New Samaritan Hospital, which was built in 1900. And here you can see this building in about 1920. This once sat at 1701 Peirce Street. I can read. This is a certificate presented to George Weare in thanks from the Women's Christian Association for his work and for his involvement in the Samaritan Hospital. George Weare had his own gigantic house at 705 Pearl Street. It was built in 1872 by W. Angelo Powell. He was a Des Moines-based architect, and he also designed that First National Bank building I showed you earlier, that nice classical revival Capitol-looking building. Here's a shot of his house in about 1890 on the corner of Pearl. This was torn down in 1913, probably because most of the Weare family was either gone or had left the city by that point, and to increase the further development of Pearl Street. The new Bishop Heelan High School is now where the Weare house used to be. So I'll show you some more pictures of it. This is also from about 1890. This garden on the north side was Mary Carpenter Ware's pride and joy. It had quite the appeal of the entire neighborhood. Over there on the very, very far left, you can see the steeple of Saint Jean Baptiste Catholic Church. That was the French Catholic Church in town. This is a floor plan that we received from the family in a big frame. I took the best picture of it that I could. And unfortunately, we only had the first floor. We don't have the upper floor, so I don't know how many bedrooms or square footage or anything like that. It was a Victorian house, and the guy was rich, so it was big. My favorite thing about this house, though, is what I've highlighted over there in red. There's not a single toilet in this entire house. George Weare was old-fashioned, and he fashioned himself an indoor outhouse. It sat right on the back of his house. It was still enclosed by the brick walls, and it's a 3-holer. I believe that's a sink, though it could be a 4th hole. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm still wigging out about it because indoor outhouse. We have some cyanotypes from the interior of this house. Some of them are better than others, so I'll kind of try to describe them as best I can. On one side of the house was 2 parlors. It took me a minute to figure out what I was looking at here. This is a spinning wheel, which can't have been used ever. It's probably a family heirloom. A chair here. Over here on the back, you can see a mantelpiece. That is actually a mirror, and you're looking at the bay window behind you. So you're like standing here and looking at that wall, but you're seeing a gigantic bay window behind you. That's where all that light is coming from. So that's the 2 parlors. This is the sitting room. Over there, those pictures, I believe, are just the Weare children. I couldn't zoom in far enough to actually see who they were, but that would be what I would assume. Notice, by the way, high Victorian fashion, the wallpaper crawling onto the ceiling. You wallpapered everything back in the Victorian age, except the floor. And speaking of fantastic wallpaper, Susanna Weare's bedroom. I don't know which bedroom this was. Again, we don't have a floor plan of the upper floors, but George Weare's oldest daughter, Susanna, she stayed in this bedroom. And George Weare passed away on November 5th, 1908. His wife Mary followed him a short time later in 1910, and they are both buried in Floyd Cemetery with some of their children, not all of them, but some. At the time of his death, George had been a banker for over 57 years. All right, so I'm going to talk briefly about some of the descendants of George Weare. I'm not going to be able to go into all of them. This is a family tree I made in Excel. I'm actually quite proud of it. But I'm mainly only going to be talking about this line here, George Weare's direct children. This family tree does cover his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and I think it goes all up to 3 greats for the grandchildren. But I'm not going to have time, obviously, to talk about all of those family members. If you're interested, if you would like a copy of this, over by where the summer camp slips are, I've included some copies of this family tree. Obviously, the print is a little bit small, so if you do want a larger copy or I didn't make enough for everybody, come by the Research Center sometime. I'm happy to print these off for you. But for the children of George and Mary Weare, we're going to start with the oldest boy, Henry Gabriel Weare, born in 1858, and he passed away in 1933. This is him at about age 19. Here you can see him a bit older with his wife, Jane Robinson Weare. And there on the left is him a bit later in life. Henry ended up becoming a cattle rancher up in Dakota Territory and later South Dakota. He was one of the founders of the town of Spearfish. And this is his ranch, the Cross Anchor, up in Spearfish, which was founded in 1883. And so he ran this cattle ranch at behest of one of his cousins, Portus B. Weare, who was the son of John Weare, Jr. They ran this ranch together, and then Henry ran it by himself. Henry had dealings and had investments in Sioux City. He was involved in some of our businesses, but most of his effort and most of his capital went into Spearfish and his cattle ranching interests up there. And here you can see, not a great picture, unfortunately, but a picture of Henry Weare a bit later in life at about 1919. And standing next to him is his nephew, Jack Nason, the oldest nephew of Henry Weare. He came out when he was a teenager to his uncle's ranch and ended up working most of his life there. Born next was Susanna Harriet Weare, whose bedroom you saw earlier. She was born in 1860, and she passed away in 1912. And here's a few shots of her throughout her life. She looks so much like Mary Carpenter, it's not even funny. Susanna's kind of awesome in that she never married. and she, from what I can tell, never really expressed interest in changing her single life. She instead devoted all of her time and attention to different societies around Sioux City. That bulleted list that you can see on the right there is just a few of the groups that I know she was a part of, but it certainly could probably fill that whole slide. And that is how she occupied her time, was devoting her time and attention to these different societies. She was one of the founders of the Sioux City Humane Society, which later became the Siouxland Humane Society and still is around today. This is a sympathy letter the society wrote in 1913 upon her death. She was also a member of the Martha Washington chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, which is still around today, and there is her membership card up there. Susanna's true passion was not only societies, but traveling. Every single year, she took trips either out to California or to the East Coast, and even all the way across into Europe. This is a picture of her in 1911 in Nantucket, Massachusetts, during a visit to her good friend Effie. And it's kind of interesting because these little clapboard houses, there's still houses in Nantucket that look that way today. So it's kind of interesting to see them on Google Maps and think that Susanna Weare may at one time have been standing or living inside of one. Moving on to the next daughter, Catherine Weare, called Kitty by her friends and family. She was born in 1865, and she passed away in 1963, 1 month after her 98th birthday. Here you can see a picture of her with her husband, John Nason, and they're over there with her daughters, which I'll talk about in a little bit. She married John Nason in 1883. He was a livestock commission agent and one of the founders of the Sioux City Livestock Exchange, which for those of you who have been around the town and know its history, this is a pretty big deal. Here's the exchange building down in the stockyards area. Unfortunately, John Nason died relatively young of cancer. He died in his 30s. And so when he passed away, Catherine, for a while, took over his livestock commission firm, and she ran it all by herself. This was unprecedented for a woman to do back then. Catherine went to a national livestock convention out in Chicago, and she was awarded the distinction of being the first and only female livestock commission agent in the nation. Afterwards, she married a friend of the family, Dr. Guy C. Rich, in 1903, and they moved out to Hollywood, California, where they both passed away. Their remains were sent back here to Sioux City, and Catherine and John are buried with Catherine's parents. And here you can see a picture of the grandchildren of George and Mary Weare. Most of them are Nasons. Up there we have Mary, the oldest, and her sister Catherine following shortly behind. Henry and Jack here, who look exactly like what happens when you tell two young boys to take a nice picture. And George Weare Nason over there. In the picture of Henry Weare in his living room earlier, you saw Jack Nason, obviously quite a bit older than he appears here. The other two kids you see in this picture are Peirces. They are the children of the final daughter of George and Mary, Mary Ellie Weare. She was born in 1868, and she passed away in 1932. And unfortunately, I don't have a too old picture of her. All I have are these three that you see here. Mary married Howard G. Peirce in 1890. He was another livestock commission agent. And by the way, yes, he is a relative of John Peirce of the Peirce Mansion. They are fourth cousins, which means they share a great-great-great-grandparent. You can see him there as Abu Bakr Potentate in about 1919. He was a member of several different commission firms that were attached to his name, Peirce and Babcock, Fitzsimmons and Peirce, and they stayed in and around Sioux City doing their livestock commission thing. Their oldest son was Howard Peirce Jr., and he passed away at the very, very young age of 27 from diphtheria in 1918. Their second born was Susanna Peirce, who married Richard Zwemmer, and their last was this boy over here, George Ashley Peirce, born in 1899. After Mary's death in 1932, Howard and his daughter Susanna, who you can see circled there, went out to the East Coast United States to live with George Ashley Peirce and his family. As wedding presents for his daughters, George Weare built them identical houses right next to each other at 1100 and 1110 Pearl Street. Today, this is Grandview Boulevard, of course. And there seems to be a conspiracy that exists to prevent me from getting a good picture of these houses. Here's the picture that the family gave us with the collection, but there's that dang old tree in the way. Here's a slightly better picture. You can see him a little bit better in this in the background of this photo of the construction of Heelan High School in 1948. And lastly, I mentioned earlier the St. Thomas, the Weare family was devout Episcopalians. They were members of the St. Thomas Episcopal Church, and the Weare Chapel inside of them is dedicated to them. Mary Weare started the construction of the Weare Chapel in 1912, and after, she started the construction, it was completed in 1912, and finished financed by Mary Peirce, her youngest daughter. This was restored in 1989 by Susanna Peirce Swemmer, and this is what the Weare Chapel in St. Thomas appears as today. And with that, thank you all very much for coming out. And if you'd like, I'm open to any questions.